Hey everybody, good Sunday afternoon to you. Hope you've been enjoying this beautiful weather. It's a little bit windy out there today, but still sun shining and warmer temperatures, and for that we are very, very grateful. I want to begin this afternoon before we get into our topic of study for today is to kind of give you a little update on our Kentucky Prayer Challenge, where we're wanting to get everybody involved in praying for every county in Kentucky. You should know by now that we met the Hart County Prayer Challenge. Every road and street, community, home is being covered in prayer in Hart County, and we've launched out beyond that into all the counties in Kentucky. And currently, and Kenneth, would you show that slide? You'll see the highlighted counties in our state that are currently taken to be prayed for, and there's somewhere in the ballpark of 97, 98 counties left. And so we need you all to jump on this and get involved. If you're a family of 3, you can take 3 counties. Family of 5, maybe you'll take 5 counties, and maybe once a week you'll gather together and pray for your county or counties together as a family. And so, with that being said, you can also go to our website, and there's a blog about this with all the information and how you can get involved in that. And so I hope you do. Today, I'm not going to really go too much in depth on the content for today. Today we're talking about the burial of Jesus. Last week we talked about Jesus' death. Next week we'll talk about Jesus' resurrection. And then the following week we'll be talking about Jesus' ascension. And I think what I want to share today about Jesus' death, firstly, as we kind of launch into this, is when we think about the gospel as a whole, we talk about Jesus' death and resurrection, and sometimes we just kind of skip over or maybe slide through thinking maybe there's not a lot of importance or details that we can glean from in thinking about the burial of Jesus. And so that's going to kind of be our content for today. And to begin with, I want to read a few verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And these are the words of Paul. And I want you to pay special attention to how Paul kind of introduces what he's about to say by talking about the gospel, and then how he defines or describes what the gospel is. And so this is what Paul says. He says, "Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which you also stand, by which you also are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that," and here comes the gospel defined or explained by Paul, and he does it in 4 parts. And here's what he says. He says that Christ died, that's 1, for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And so Paul really kind of breaks down the gospel really in 3 areas. I added a 4th there about his appearing to some. That was just for evidence, but primarily when you think about 4 parts of the gospel, you really include ascension, when Jesus goes back to heaven to be at the right hand of the Father, which is where he currently is. And we'll get into that for the last week in our series. But notice that Paul certainly includes the burial of Jesus in the plan, in God's plan of the gospel. Jesus' death, Jesus' burial, and Jesus' resurrection. And then, of course, his ascension. And so today we want to just spend a couple of minutes. Don't want to go too deep on this. From Matthew chapter 27, and thinking about Jesus' burial. I think what I want us to see, not only from this passage, but the other gospel accounts as well, that God went to great lengths to ensure that Jesus' burial, along with his resurrection and his ascension, would occur precisely according to the Old Testament prophecies. And I think why that is so important for us to understand and kind of glean from is that it really points to God's providence and his sovereignty, God being in control, God on the throne. You know, there's a lot of ideas out there, even among Christians, that God just kind of began the world and he's kind of somewhere out in space or eternity now, and he just kind of has his hands off of everything, and this is why everything is spiraling wildly out of control, waiting until finally Jesus comes to, finally and completely rescue us. Nothing could be further from the truth. God is on the throne. He is sovereign. He is provident. He is all-knowing. He's all-seeing. He's intricately involved in every jot and tittle of events and circumstances and things that are going on in the world, in the same way that he was intricately involved even in the details of Jesus's burial. And when you think about somebody dying and being buried, you don't think about a lot of thought going into that, a lot of detail. But with God, it was very much true in his son's burial. And I think what I want us to notice also is that God uses three pairs of unconventional people to be involved in, to be witnesses to, and then later on to be the ones who would give testimony to Jesus' resurrection, and how God used these pairs of people from all walks of life to really solidify Jesus' burial, immediately following his death, and then soon to be resurrection, and then finally his ascension. So Matthew 27, let me read a few of these verses, then we'll make a couple of comments, and then I want to wrap it up by kind of letting us know how that applies to us today, or how we can glean from the truths in Matthew 27 to our current day. Matthew 27:57. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. Okay, that's one of the pairs of individuals. Now, it's not mentioned here, but it's mentioned in the book of John that Nicodemus, a guy by the name of Nicodemus, was there as well. And what's interesting and also very detailed in this is that we know that where it says in verse 57, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. Back in Isaiah chapter 53, it was prophesied that a rich man would be involved in the burial of Jesus. And so God has gone to great lengths, and he's very precise and intricate in the details of even in Jesus' burial. And so verse 57 is solidifying the truth that God is very much interested in Jesus' death and the details of his death matching what has been prophesied in the Old Testament, specifically in this case, Isaiah 53. Now, Nicodemus is not mentioned in Matthew 27, but again, he's mentioned back in the book of John as being another one who is present. And I think John chapter 19, to help take care of the body of Jesus. I think it's interesting as well to think about the timeline between Jesus' actual death and when he was buried was all somewhere in the ballpark of about a 3-hour window. According to biblical scholars, Jesus was nailed to a cross about 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. At 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, he died. And then at 6 o'clock, somewhere between 3 and 6, Jesus was taken from the cross. His body was prepared for burial. He was put in the tomb, all in a 3-hour window. And so I think that's a very interesting detail as well. That 3-hour window and how all of it came about just precisely and needed to happen at that point. So then we read on. It says, this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb, and went away. And here come the second pair of unlikely characters involved in the details of Jesus' burial. In verse 61, it says, Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the grave. And so these two Marys were there as well. And they actually would be the ones to first to witness the empty tomb, the stone rolled away. Now, I think what's so important about that as well is that in Jewish culture, women were not deemed or seen as very important. They were certainly considered to be lower, I guess, if you will, on the scale in comparison to men. You know, men were the leaders. They were the bosses. They were the ones that were in charge. They were the priests. They were the teachers. They were the ones that knew the scriptures and taught the scriptures. And yet, two women were the ones who were involved in Jesus' burial and became witnesses to the empty tomb, which I think is very important. So God continues as he kind of unfolds this story of Jesus' burial, chock full of details that are very, very important and precise, especially as it relates to making sure that the Old Testament prophecies would be fulfilled. Also, back to Joseph and Nicodemus, this may or may not be something you know, but we read elsewhere in the Gospels that these men, they weren't very out front. They weren't among the 12 disciples that were close and public and vocal about being disciples of Christ or followers of Jesus. These two were mentioned as, I guess, secret disciples. They didn't really want anybody to know that they were believers in the Lord or outward, demonstrators of their belief and their faith in Christ. But yet, they were the ones who were there that day to request before Pilate to have the body of Jesus, and so something happened between Jesus' death and his burial that they were ready to, I guess, go public with their faith, and so they did. And so there you have the pair of secret disciples, you have the pair of women, the both Marys, and then you have a pair of religious leaders that were also there and present. And we pick up in verse 62. It says, "Now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember that when we was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I am to rise again. Therefore, give orders to the grave to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first.' Pilate said to them, 'You have a guard, go, make it as secure as you know how.' And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone." And so you have these religious leaders, these pairs of religious leaders, the chief priest and the Pharisees, that were involved in the burial of Jesus, primarily to ensure that somebody didn't come and steal the body of Jesus. And they wanted to make sure that what they had previously gone through with all the riots and the excitement of Jesus and his followers, that didn't happen again. And so even they were intricately involved in the details of Jesus's burial. A couple of other facts here from the Old Testament, from Psalm 34. It mentions that no bones of Jesus would be broke. We know that to be true as we read the accounts in the New Testament. Each of the criminals on both sides of Jesus, their legs were broke so that they would drop, their body weight would drop and suffocate and die quickly, because they needed to hurt and get it over with, because they couldn't have dead people hanging around on crosses for very long during this Passover time. And so that was true. And then also Jesus himself prophesied in Matthew chapter 12 that he would be buried for 3 days and then rise again. And so it was important that Jesus die on the Friday so that he could have that 3 days, 3-day time period of being buried, which was prophesied about. And so it had to be fulfilled precisely in that manner and according to those details. And so, man, there's a whole lot more we could jump into and say about all of this. But I think here's why it's important for us. Not only is Jesus' burial a part of the gospel, Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. That is the gospel in a nutshell. I think what's cool about all this and amazing, divinely amazing, is how God was so intricately involved in every little detail of Jesus' life, his birth, his life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, his ascension, which all points to God's sovereignty and his providence, and how God is not haphazard, and that nothing happens by chance or coincidence. God is absolutely in control. And when you look at all that and then bring it into today, and especially in light of everything that we're experiencing worldwide now, and even in the United States, and now even closer, getting closer and closer to home. Let's not make any mistakes, and we know and we believe and understand that God is sovereign, he's in control, he has a plan, he has a purpose, and he is intricately involved in every detail of every event and circumstance and death and life. And it's His plan, it's His purpose, and He has promised in His Word that all things work together for good to those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. And so we know that God works in both good circumstances and bad circumstances for our good, but most of all for His glory. And so take that for what it's worth, chew on it, meditate, ponder, and really just know and understand that God is a God of detail, and He is a God of control and providence, and nothing happens by chance or coincidence. And for that reason, we can rest assured and put our trust and our faith in Him that ultimately He's got this, and that everything's going to be good. Love you guys. Have a good evening. See you next time.